The situation at the southern border of the United States has recently escalated. In March 2024, National Guard troops stationed in El Paso, Texas, faced a challenging scenario where hundreds of migrants breached a checkpoint, despite efforts to secure the area with razor wire. The incident resulted in the arrest of 9 individuals for assaulting the soldiers. I happen to personally know just how sensitive this kind of domestic mission is from the point of view of one of those Texas National Guardsmen. Years after I got back from Iraq, I was mobilized for disaster relief during Hurricane Sandy in New York City. The entire city lost electrical power and ran short on gasoline supplies for days. I saw just how quickly people go from saying, "Thank you for your service," to, "Hey, go f yourself, where's my gasoline?" It turns out that it only takes about 72 hours. In another situation, we tried to stop widespread looting, but without any legal authority to arrest anyone, I felt powerless and unable to help. I think the problem I had then is similar to the one at the border today. It's the problem of scarcity. U.S. authorities' ability to process visas, asylum requests, protect citizens, and provide social services to all those in need is strained. Now imagine adding on to that the fact that these National Guardsmen in Texas are at the center of a major legal battle, and we can now see why this situation gets even more challenging. Because officials between the state of Texas and the federal government have come to a head over disagreements on who has ultimate authority. A recent ruling by the Supreme Court regarding how Texas can conduct border policing has divided the American population, and at the center of this disagreement has been Texas's Operation Lone Star. What is Operation Lone Star? It's a mobilization of thousands of National Guard troops to the border. It's a joint effort between the Texas Department of Public Safety, which controls a large portion of the state law enforcement, and the Texas Military Department, which handles the Army and Air National Guard, essentially the military's reserve force. Part of the reason we're seeing this happening in Texas is because they are naturally taking on the majority of these attempted crossings, with its part of the border stretching 1,200 miles, the longest of any state. And so starting in March of 2021, Operation Lone Star began setting up razor wire, floating barriers in the Rio Grande, and even 30-foot-high walls in an attempt to control the flow of people, specifically to send them to legal ports of entry. To contextualize the magnitude of the issue, there was a record number of 2.3 million apprehensions or migrant encounters in 2023. That's equal to about 7% of the total population of Texas of 30 million people. It's worth taking a quick second to define the differences between 3 important terms that I'll be using: refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. According to Amnesty International, a refugee is a person who's fled their own country because they're at risk of serious human rights violations and persecution there. An asylum seeker is someone who's waiting to be legally recognized as a refugee, meaning they're waiting for their paperwork to process. Meanwhile, the definition of migrant isn't as clear-cut. There's no international legal definition of who a migrant is. But in simple layman terms, and the way I'm going to use it here in this video, there's someone who leaves their home country to move somewhere else. The reason behind migrant travel can be economic, poverty, violence, political instability, natural disaster, or simply to reunite with family members living abroad. Most migrants that arrive in the United States do end up applying for asylum. I want to bring your attention to the town of Eagle Pass, Texas, home to about 28,000 residents. It's seen some of the biggest number of illegal crossings. It's right across the border from Piedras Negras, Mexico. The situation here is one of the clearest examples, I think, of the state versus federal problem that has actually occurred across the whole border. This is because the Eagle Pass International Bridge here is operated by U.S. Border Patrol and U.S. Customs, who are federal agents. Just north of the bridge is Shelby Park, a 47-acre recreational area. Texas state officials ordered the National Guard to occupy the park and assume direct authority of its security because they argued migrants were taking advantage of lax enforcement policies from the federal agents. Different Texas officials put forth different reasons for the alleged failures of the federal government, from simply not having enough manpower in the area to more direct accusations that federal agencies were deliberately not enforcing laws. Controversy erupted, though, when a woman and 2 children were found drowned in the river just outside the park. This tragedy is where reports begin to conflict. Federal investigations claim that the Border Patrol alerted National Guard troops of the distressed migrants, and that they did nothing to rescue the trio. Now, Texas lawyers responded to the investigation, saying that by the time the National Guard state troops were alerted, the three had already drowned, and that they didn't see anyone attempting to cross. Specific to the investigation was the accusation that it was the miles of state-emplaced razor wire along the river that had ultimately caused that. Texas officials responded that none of this would have happened if no one tried to cross illegally in the first place. It's hard for me to imagine just how emotional, how charged and heated the situation must be for federal and state personnel to conflict like this. When I was mobilized, I worked alongside FEMA federal agents in disaster relief. If I felt like they were working actively in cross purposes with me, that would be very frustrating. So, what happened was federal Border Patrol agents claimed that the Texas National Guard troops were blocking their access to Shelby Park. This quickly resulted in a legal battle at the Supreme Court level. The 5-4 vote ended with federal agents being allowed access to the park. On January 24th, Governor Abbott asserted that federal agents would still not be allowed in the park and that additional C-wire would be placed along the border. The Supreme Court ruling also spurred several states to deploy additional National Guard troops, including Missouri, Oklahoma, Indiana, Florida, and others. In total, 25 state governors signed a letter pledging to support Texas in their efforts despite the Supreme Court ruling. The state was given the ultimatum of January 26 to vacate, or allow federal agents in. To this day, as far as I know, the Texas National Guard still occupies and provides security for Shelby Park. Now let's take a step back from the zoomed-in picture of the challenges of migration and briefly look at the bigger picture, because the geopolitical relationship between the United States and Mexico is about way more than just immigration. Many people don't know this, but in 2023, Mexico became America's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade at $855 billion in 2022. Which not just surpassed China, but also limited reliance on China. 400 major companies are looking to relocate from China and Asia to Mexico, which is strongly in the United States' favor. And so finding a solution to cooperate on immigration and cartel violence is also important at the strategic level. One of those potential solutions is Operation Lone Star. It claims to increase manpower needed at the border. At first, it was only made up of about 500 members of the Texas National Guard, but that number quickly rose to 2,200. This was done under Texas House Bill 9, which allocated $3 billion to be used for border security efforts. Then Texas made a declaration of disaster for 53 counties, which enabled them to deploy even more National Guard soldiers. Within half a year, the number had risen to 10,000 from the Guard, which is the total authorization to this day. Then, Texas Executive Order GA-41 led to 10 of the M113 armored personnel carriers to be mobilized. Personally, I think the armored vehicles arrived as part of a military concept that we call show of force. It's a tactic that's as common as cornbread. It's a strategic demonstration of capability designed to convey a message. The message could be to deter cartel members and crossing attempts. It aims to achieve this by increasing the credibility of the border security elements. From a crisis management point of view, it's meant to signal there's a high level of commitment behind Operation Lone Star. In Texas, they would say it's better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. But why is it called Operation Lone Star in the first place? Like many military missions, naming conventions, there's some symbolism to it that's as old as dirt. It comes from the state's nickname Lone Star, which comes from its flag that was adopted first in 1836 after Texas fought for independence from Mexico. For a decade, Texas was actually its own independent republic before accepting being annexed into the United States. So Lone Star has this history and symbolism that reflects a kind of go-it-alone independent spirit that has always been evident in the culture in Texas to this day. And part of the reason Texas can take on these kind of drastic actions is because they're seen as an influential state. They have a GDP of over $2 trillion, about the same as Brazil for rough context, which is useful if you want to pay for something like Operation Lone Star that has an estimated annual cost of $2 billion. The reason they say the cost is justified, though, partly has to do with how Texas farmers and ranchers have had their property destroyed, crops ruined, and cut or ram fences on a weekly basis. This is actually done by traffickers called coyotes who are paid to help people cross the border. Now, what this leads to is water lines cut, livestock escaping, an increased number of stolen vehicles, which has all cost thousands of dollars to ranchers. What's one of the factors that has recently changed to make the situation at the border worse? Well, part of it has to do with a record number of increased production of illicit substances. Quote, new improvements and innovations in conversion of the cocoa plant to cocaine have helped production boom, raising by 35% between 2021 and 2022 to record levels. Compounding the problem is the fact that global demand for the substances has only grown over the years as well, with 30% of that demand, the highest number, coming from North America. Then second place is Central America at 24%, and third place is Europe with 21%. Cartels then use the money to pay for weapons and to bribe officials. Corruption has made some authorities near the border as crooked as a barrel of fishhooks. According to the United Nations 2022 survey, 90% of migrants who planned to enter the US from Mexico had fled violence, extortion, armed clashes, or organized crime, and 25% of them reported having a family member who disappeared. US lawmakers debate just how much of a threat this is, but some claim that the cartels should be labeled as foreign terrorist organizations and requires military strikes against them. I have some perspective of what it's like to be an Army Guard soldier on a domestic mission, but what I don't have any idea of what it's like is to be in the shoes of a migrant. This story from Reuters by Deanna Beth Solomon and Laura Gossendiner gives insight into that. Maria, a nurse's aide from the Mexican state of Michoacan, which has been rocked by conflict for years, said she fled with her 3 children in October after the cartel killed her partner and delivered his head to her front door in a box. Managing crowds of people who are coming from that situation is very difficult. When you have a powder keg of a situation like this, where local people and law enforcement are getting pulled into an international situation, one thing I think would be valuable is additional training for these soldiers. If you're not familiar, the Army National Guard is a reserve force that typically trains 1 week in a month and 2 weeks a year. They're then occasionally activated and pulled out of their civilian lives to perform full-time missions, sometimes domestically for a few months, and sometimes deployed to combat zones overseas, like Iraq or Syria, for a year. I would assume some of them are 31 Bravos, or military police, who are qualified for keeping the peace and trained at de-escalating. But I would also guess that there are a lot of 11 Bravos, which is what I was, infantry types, who are trained in mainly one area, pulling triggers, taking territory, and closing with the enemy. I think soldiers on the US border would benefit from additional funds, training, and equipment geared towards crowd control and de-escalation. So, how can we evaluate the performance of Operation Lone Star so far? Governor Abbott and his supporters have argued that it's already set out to do what it aimed to do. Evidence supporting these claims comes from the fact that by January 2024, state troopers had detained around 500,000 people, they had filed more than 39,000 criminal charges, and when it comes to fentanyl alone, they seized 450 million lethal-sized doses from the cartel. That sounds more than good enough for government work to me. Now, while migrant encounters did rise 6% in Texas during the first year, they actually rose 62% in neighboring Arizona, California, and New Mexico. That could mean that without Operation Lone Star, Texas would have also seen a 60% increase in encounters, or it could mean that those attempting to cross simply decided to go across another state, which made other state numbers higher. There's different theories. Patterns like these are complex issues that shift from year to year as it is, making it tough to pin down singular causes. On the other hand, state officials who are skeptical of Operation Lone Star claim that it would be a net loss in the National Guard's capabilities for conducting other missions, such as natural disaster relief or training for future combat deployments overseas. One of the main problems cited is that the living conditions are found to be reportedly spare. They didn't have the correct gear to deal with wet or cold conditions during the winter months. The rapid nature of the initial mobilization meant that their actual role was ambiguous at first. One guardsman said that they didn't have many of the authorities needed to play an active role in policing the border. They were charged with providing logistical support and observations, calling in law enforcement to conduct the actual apprehensions, because the Guard and most any military personnel are not legally allowed to make arrests domestically, usually. To address these issues of living conditions, on February 16, 2024, Governor Abbott in Texas announced Forward Operating Base Eagle. This base camp is an 80-acre base in the town of Eagle Pass near Shelby Park in Texas. It's a location that has become central to the crisis. The camp is estimated to have room for up to 2,300 soldiers and plans to establish a state law enforcement infrastructure in a region where Texas is contesting the federal government's claim of sole authority. One of the main stated goals is to consolidate the troops and increase living conditions for them when they were previously scattered across the region. It'll serve as a launching point and logistics hub. This facility will cost $140 million to put up and run annually. For context, Texas state budget is $144 billion a year. Even if Operation Lone Star is a success, there are some factors that might be out of their hands. Because you might be surprised to learn that only 37% of people attempting to cross in the United States originated from Mexico, while the other 63%, roughly 1 million people, were from other countries like Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. This is a significant break from historical trends. In the past, the number was far more simply migration from Mexico. And this change is important to keep in mind, because it indicates that it's not just a challenge between the US and Mexico, it's a massive, complex international issue across all of Latin America that'll likely require equally complex solutions. All the Latin American nations have a combined population of about 700 million people, or twice that of the United States, to give some insight into the scale of the issue. Now, before we go any further, I want to say that I think the information that we get about the border is oftentimes colored by what we hear in the mainstream media, which inevitably has a bias one way or another. That's why I've spent the last 5 years growing a viewer base of people like you who have very different points of view, and I try to share both perspectives with you. That's why I think the perfect sponsor for this video is Ground News, a news aggregation platform that makes it easy to compare sources, read between the lines of media bias, and break free from algorithms. I spend an enormous amount of time verifying and cross-referencing facts and sources for the stories you hear on this channel, and I can say, having this tool to group the different sources reporting on the same story is a massively beneficial service that can help provide the most factual accounting of what's actually happening. Take this article for instance. Recently, a court ruled in favor of putting the Texas migrants arrest law on hold. On Ground News, I can instantly access more than 100 articles published on this alone and get context about each source, like how biased or reliable it may be. You can check all this out for yourself by heading over to ground.news/task or by scanning the QR code on the screen to get 40% off the Vantage plan with unlimited access to all Ground News features. Okay, and back to the episode. In 2022, the US had a positive net immigration of over 1 million people, which indicates to me that this is a desirable or attractive country to live in. When you compare that to the United States' main competitor and rival, China, they have a net negative immigration number of 300,000. On a geopolitical level, this means that the United States is very competitive and has access to some of the world's best and brightest minds. A prime example of this is the new semiconductor plant being built in Arizona by 2025, which will limit the United States' strategic vulnerability and their reliance on foreign chips for technology used in weapons production. The plant will reportedly heavily rely on skilled immigrants to build because there's a shortage of that kind of labor domestically in the US. Legal immigration has always been one of the United States' greatest strengths. China is going to have difficulty attracting that same talent. With some of the advantages of having an attractive country, there can also come with flip sides of the coin with challenges. Social services can quickly become overwhelmed. One solution Texas came up with was putting 100,000 migrants on buses and sending them to New York City. This started in 2022 at a cost of $12 million from Operation Lone Star. It's estimated to cost $12 billion from $98 billion annual New York City budget to house and care for the migrants over the next 3 years. Texas did this partly because New York City is a sanctuary city, which means they legally have to care for them. This has meant that 2,000 migrants have had to live in tent shelters on an abandoned airfield in Brooklyn. The facilities are at risk of flooding from storms. Then a total of 70,000 migrants have been sent to hotels, homeless shelters, schools, and tents. This isn't my first rodeo. When I was activated for hurricane disaster relief, I worked at a temporary homeless shelter for a few weeks in New York City and saw what happens when there is a shortage of supplies. It can sound simple to take care of people, but when you do it at scale and for longer periods of time, it becomes clear why these types of situations are called disasters. I saw hundreds of people packed into public school gyms with cots with no hygiene kits provided by the state, so they resorted to washing the drinking fountains. I helped social workers try to find more permanent housing solutions for each person, but there was never enough time to get everyone. I was thrown into the difficult position of being responsible for people's health and safety at the same time. In response to the increased cost of the city, Mayor Eric Adams plans to cut the city's budget in police, waste management, and public education. In New York City, laws in place since 1981 require the city to provide shelter for the unhoused. These favorable laws, and the history of New York City being the entry point of America's immigrants, creates an unequal strain on the city resources compared to other places in the US. Setting people up for failure is a losing strategy, and so authorities provide migrants with free food, free cell phones, free transit passes, and they pay $500 a night for hotel rooms, provide free school and free healthcare. This has led people to feeling like it's unfair for some people to be helped out and others not. A prime example of the security concern that has to do with instability spilling over comes if we look at what happened to Ecuador recently in South America. It's now a crisis situation where transnational cartels from Mexico and Colombia have slowly gained more control of their ports. Between 2018 and today, they've gone from one of the safest countries in Latin America to the second highest homicide rate. The situation culminated when in January 2024, armed gangs escaped from prison and held a news station hostage. Similar instability has recently been witnessed in Haiti and El Salvador. There are three main national security concerns raised about the border. First, according to unclassified DEA reports, Mexican cartels have now established distribution hubs in many major American cities. Estimates from an unnamed U.S. defense official place total Mexican cartel membership at about 100,000 foot soldiers, rivaling the Mexican army. Mexico has between 350,000 and 420,000 homicides since 2016. Despite joint efforts between the United States and Mexico to curb cartel violence, rates have failed to significantly drop. Currently, between 30 and 35% of Mexican territory is said to be controlled by one of the several major cartels operating in the area, as cartels battle to assert control over the lucrative smuggling routes into the United States. Generally, cartels avoid violence against Americans as it would bring on too much scrutiny and heat from the US, and it's likely to disrupt their business practices. But that hasn't stopped all violence, because stray small arms fire into the United States from Mexico has become a common problem in some parts of the border towns. Through 2022, violence across the border continued to rise. In response, Texas Governor Abbott signed 2 executive orders that declared Texas as being invaded and designated Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations. However, Mexico also claims that the border is having a national security impact on them as well. It's a two-way street, because in January 2024, Mexico requested the United States investigate claims that the U.S. Army specific belt-fed machine guns, grenade launchers, and rocket launchers were trafficked into Mexico. Mexico claims 70% of the weapons used by the cartel actually come from the United States production. However they got their way into Mexico, the phenomena of U.S. weapons flooding into Latin America has been coined the Iron River. Now, the second national security concern is it's not just cartel concerns that experts are worried about. According to this document published by the Department of Homeland Security, in 2023, U.S. border agents arrested 160 individuals at the southern border whose names were on the FBI's terrorist watch list. If we put national security concerns aside for just a moment, one of the largest factors drawing immigration to the United States right now is economic opportunity. If you think wealth inequality is bad in the United States, just take a look at where the worst offenders of this wealth inequality are really located. This data helps explain why so many people from South and Central America are moving north to seek fairer opportunities for work, while only the few hold all their nation's wealth. This is an imperfect measurement, but it helps give us some indication of why people want to move to the United States. Meanwhile, armed conflict, drug violence, authoritarianism, persecution, political unrest, and natural disasters in Latin America also all add fuel to the fire. The allure of chasing the American dream and building a better future for yourself and your family is a strong driver for immigration as old as America itself. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free" is the song of New York's Statue of Liberty. Part of what sets the United States apart from their adversaries is their ability in the past to absorb people from all over the world and unify them under one culture with similar shared values. Now, according to the United Nations, more than 7.7 million people have left Venezuela in search of protection and better lives. While right now, many may not have the means to travel all the way to the United States, each year more are making the perilous journey through some of the most dangerous jungle on Earth, a 66-mile stretch between Panama and Colombia called the Darien Gap, just to reach the United States. In 2022, over 240,000 people crossed the Darien Gap with the hopes to get to the United States of America. Another major factor for migration would have been hard to predict a few years ago: COVID. During 2020, in an effort to help reduce the spread of COVID, then President Donald Trump invoked what's called Article 42, which allowed federal Border Patrol agents to immediately expel migrants rather than having to detain them. Title 42 is a clause within the Public Health Service Law that says the US government can prevent the introduction of individuals during certain public health emergencies. The law is from 1944, and both President Trump and President Biden used the COVID-19 pandemic to enforce this clause. As a result, over 2 million migrants from around the world were deported when normally they would have had the right to claim asylum. Then, President Biden continued to keep Article 42 on the books, but the associated expulsions were done to a much lesser degree. For example, in July of 2020, under Trump, 93% of migrant encounters resulted in expulsion and 7% in apprehension. A year later, in July of 2021, under Biden, 47% of encounters ended with expulsion and 53% in apprehension. Then, the biggest change to all this happened on May 11, 2023, when Title 42 was ended. The anticipation of Title 42's expiration affected migrant movements, with many purposefully timing their arrival at the border to coincide with its expiration. What evidence do we have for that? Here are some of the misinformation shared online to thousands of migrants on Facebook explaining that the doors to migration will be, quote, wide open after Title 42. To understand how powerful social media is for migration, a study done on the migrant path through North Africa to Europe concluded that for migrants, Wi-Fi hotspots are as crucial as water. This, coupled with the belief that President Biden's administration will be more sympathetic to migrants, create a bubble on the border. Reporters on the ground found that many people waited in Mexico for Title 42 to expire before trying to cross into the United States. What has replaced Title 42? For now, the law is set back to Title 8, meaning migrants crossing the border are allowed to seek asylum. However, if they're determined to not have justification, they face a 5-year ban from the United States or possible criminal prosecution. This is both a harsher punishment for those crossing the border without justification, but also a longer process unfit for handling the massive influx of migrants crossing. With the end of Title 42 and the increase in migration from it, it prompted Texas officials to send letters to neighboring states calling for what they called the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which would create a system for states to pool resources to tackle the immigration problem. So far, 14 states have sent their own National Guard troops to the border of Texas and Mexico to provide support for the operation. A private billionaire donor even donated enough money to help pay for some of these state National Guard missions. You know you made it when you can pay for your own National Guard mission. This is my grandmother Grace, the strongest person I've ever met in my life. She was born in Spain in 1929 and was 7 years old when the Spanish Civil War started in 1936. She spent days in shelters as planes dropped bombs overhead. Her father went to fight against Franco. He never came home. Grace was left an orphan, stealing food to survive. She came to the United States to escape war and poverty and find a better life in 1947. I wouldn't live in the US today if it weren't for her coming from Spain. I can't imagine what it must be like to be in poverty like that or face cartel violence where you live. At the same time, I also understand that there's a legitimate security concern at the border in addition to the humanitarian crisis, which is why I think this situation is so complicated. The situation at the border has brought up important questions about things like states' rights, constitutional authority, national security, how to handle humanitarian issues, and a slew of economic and political problems that come with it. Regardless of what side of the issue you find yourself supporting, the important thing is we try to stay as objectively informed as possible, and you can hang your hat on that. I worked on this with a team of 2 researchers over the course of 10 months to try to bring you an objective and personal look into this issue that I felt like was maybe missing from the mainstream media conversation on this issue. I did my best to present you with the facts and perspectives I don't often see. I hope you found this video informative. Follow me at Cappy Army on Instagram and Twitter for live updates on the situation on the border. I'm your average infantryman, Cappy, signing off on this net. Time now.